Welcome to Science Fiction Writers Week. Before we get started, here's some important information about the week. During the week, you can chat with other participants, ask questions of speakers, share key wins and takeaways in our online community. To find the community, go to community.prowritingaid.com. You can find session times, session descriptions, and all replays on the Science Fiction Writers Week Hub. Navigate to a session and hit the drop-down arrow beside the title to access a replay. You can find the link to the Hub in the chat or in any of the emails we're sending throughout the week. Replays are available for everyone until September 9th. If you want continued replay access, you can upgrade to Pro Writing Academy for 50% off during Science Fiction Writers Week. In addition to the software integrations and editing suggestions available to free and premium users, the Academy tier includes access to live training intensives led by best-selling authors, hundreds of on-demand video workshops and exercises, and weekly accountability check-ins, among other things. Our first live training intensive begins September 5th and is led by Jessica Brody, the #1 best-selling author of Save the Cat Writes a Novel. This training intensive includes on-demand training as well as live sessions with Jessica every week. To learn more about Pro Writing Academy and access your 50% off discount, click the link in the chat. We're just about ready to get started. Remember to use the Q&A button to ask questions of our speaker during the session. Thank you for coming, and we hope you enjoy this session.
Hey, it's Lisa here from Pro Writing Aid. For those of you that were expecting Haley, she's not going to be here today. I've just come back from my summer holiday, and I've missed the other couple of sessions, but it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and names from the other events that we've had in the past. And it's great to see so many new folks here. So can everyone see me and hear me? If you can, just drop a quick yes in the chat. Yes, from Jesse, Shannon, Brian, Casey, great. And I love, like always, seeing that people are coming in from all over the world. It's so exciting. And thank you to everybody that got up at 5 a.m. That's very early, and I really appreciate it. For any of the sessions that I missed, let me know what I should go back and watch the replay of. It sounds like Andy Weir was hilarious. So I've got him at the top of my list of sessions that I should watch. But any other sessions that I should put on my list, let me know, drop them in the chat, and I'll add them to my to-watch list. And for those of you that haven't seen me before, I'm Lisa Lepke. I'm Pro Writing Aid CMO. I was the second ever team member at Pro Writing Aid, and it's honestly such a thrill for me to come to events like this, because they're truly what we dreamed of back when we were starting the company. We envisaged a place where writers could come together and learn and inspire and motivate each other. And really, we're all a bit obsessed with books and stories, and we wanted to play some small role in helping bring more stories into the world. So thank you for being here today, because, I mean, you're sort of making those dreams come true for me. But enough about me. Today we are joined by Rachelle Atalla. She is a Scottish Egyptian novelist and screenwriter based in Glasgow, and she previously worked as a community pharmacist for a decade, which may sound like random information to give you, but it's important for when we talk about her first book. Her short stories have been published widely in literary anthologies. She was the recipient of the Scottish Book Trust New Writers Award, and she co-edits New Writing Scotland. Her first novel, The Pharmacist, was published earlier this year and received great reviews. I read it on my holiday and was totally captivated. And her second novel will be out early next year, and it's going to be called Thirsty Animals, which I think is such a brilliant title. She's also a screenwriter, and her first short film screenplay, Trifle, was commissioned by the Scottish Film and Talent Network. And most recently, she was selected to participate in the 2021 Young Film Foundation Sky Residency Program. And as part of that, she's developing her first feature-length screenplay with BBC Films. So let's begin. Rachelle, are you there?
Hello, hi. Can you hear me?
Hi, I love it when people appear from the ether ready to chat. So thank you so much for being here. I just finished your first book, and for those of you that are putting together your conference reading list, you must put The Pharmacist on it, because it's unlike anything I've read before. So thank you for spending a bit of time today with us.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
No problem. So what we always like to do is talk to writers about writing process, almost more than their books, almost more than anything else. So let's talk about how you began began? How did you get your start as a writer? And did you always want to be a writer?
Yes and no. So the very first start I got into writing was because I was a pharmacist and I had just qualified and realised that there was no creativity, shockingly, in pharmacy. And so I very randomly picked up a prospectus and started looking for evening classes. And I ended up starting creative writing evening classes about 10 years ago, 10, 11 years ago. And that's how it started. I started writing short stories and just fell in love with the way we told stories and just wanted to learn more. And that kind of led me down the path towards novel writing. So it's been quite a long journey. I feel like quite often people think that, you know, your first book comes out and you've just overnight been writing it and ta-da, but actually no, I find most writers agree that it's been a long slog to get to this point. But I didn't grow up. I was a reader, but I didn't grow up thinking that I was going to be a writer. I grew up in a small town in Scotland and there weren't any writers that I knew, so I just didn't really think that that was something that you could do. And it wasn't until very gradually through the writing process and learning to write that I thought, oh, this is maybe something that I could do. But it took me till the age of about 25, 26 to realise that people could be authors. I know that sounds ridiculous to some. Yeah.
No, I know exactly what you mean. It feels like something that other people do, or that you have to have been born being able to write this amazing fiction. Like Margaret Atwood just came out with The Handmaid's Tale.
It's magical.
Yeah. And we talk a lot about that in our community, about how writing is a skill that you learn, and that, you know, maybe you're not great at the beginning because you haven't learned the techniques and the skills. Absolutely. And, you know, and all of those classes and practice is what gets you where you need to be.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think having a willingness to want to learn, to continue to learn and get better is the main thing. And I think even if you don't want to get published, you want to write, you just have to be willing to, and show your people your work as well, and take guidance from people's opinions that you trust. So,
yeah. It's scary though to put your first
writing
out into the world. So was it always sci-fi and speculative fiction that
got me into? No, so actually The Pharmacist, which is my first novel, is my first step into speculative kind of sci-fi writing. So everything up until this point had been kind of contemporary drama. And then what made me make the leap was I was in Berlin about 2015, 2016 with my husband, and we were at a museum that, unbeknown to us, included a tour of a nuclear bunker. And I stepped into this bunker that was, I mean, it could have held about a few thousand people. And it just kind of took my breath away. I couldn't really believe, I mean, I knew bunkers existed, obviously, but I hadn't really ever hadn't thought about writing about them before. And so I stepped into this world, and immediately there was all these kind of societal questions that came into play for me. And I just couldn't stop thinking about it. And so that's how I came to start writing about The Pharmacist. And before I knew it, I was writing in this kind of like sci-fi speculative world, which I'm now kind of obsessed by. I think world building is like the most interesting thing. So that's how The Pharmacist came about. And I think with kind of speculative fiction, it made me realize that you can ask really difficult questions about society, because your world is not limited. You know, you can create this huge big space and anything's possible. And I think that's a really interesting space to interrogate questions about the world in which we live. Yes.
Interesting. And so other stories that you wrote in the past, did they start with that same central idea, or have you ever started with a character? What's the seed normally?
What's the seed? Oh, that's a good question.
You have a really clear seed for this one, right?
Yeah, although I had a very clear seed, but I didn't know, it wasn't until I found the character's voice and their character that actually things took off. So I suppose on a basic level, I think I'm very character driven. All my writing, regardless of what I'm writing about, is character driven. But I think the seed can be anything. It can be, me overhearing a conversation or have something happen to me. And it can be this tiny little detail, but if it sticks in my mind, I tend to let it brew for a little while. and then, you know, put pen to paper and see what comes. I'm not a particularly organized writer, and I don't tend to plan too much in advance. I just like to have, if there's something that catches my attention, I tend to write it down more out of habit now, because if I don't write it down, I forget very quick. Yeah, just gone. And it happens all the time, and I get really irritated by my lack of organization. But yeah, it can be anything, but it'll be the seed of something, but then I'll tend to think about the character most of all. I might have a very vague idea of where I want to start and a very loose idea of where I go, and I just see what happens. With short stories, I tend to write them on paper. I wouldn't have said that I was like a superstitious person, but I seem to have these little systems. If I deviate, I kind of worry about the success of the story. So with short stories, I tend to write on paper, and again, it'll just be that loose idea, loose seed. Well, let's see where it goes. But with novel writing, I've had to accept that it's straight onto a laptop, because trying to transcribe a novel from a notebook is not ideal. But yeah, and then I tend to spend a lot of time editing after that. What's been interesting is, since I started writing for screen, is that particularly if someone's paying you for the development, they don't let you get to a script until you've done outline after outline. And so that's been a real learning curve, because I never used to plan like that with my books. But I can see the benefit of both, because I think if you did more outlining to start with, you probably have to do less editing and shuffling as you go with a novel.
Yeah, it's maybe work at the beginning and work at the end, but it's probably the same number of hours in the end. But that's
Perhaps,
interesting.
yeah.
So you're more of a pantser, you have an idea in your head and sit down and see where it takes you?
I would say so, because I think I worry that if I'm too prescriptive in the planning, then I won't deviate when I should deviate. You know, sometimes I think that, I think sometimes the best parts of fiction come when you least expect them, when you kind of let your subconscious take over, almost like an automatic writing. You know, you get into the zone and you see what happens. And I tend to find that a lot of the little nuggets that I really love in my own work come when they're not planned. But if I was very prescriptive, I worry that I would just never get them, because I'd be so focused on saying, well, no, this is the plan, and this is what I need to get to, so I better just focus on that. But then obviously there are loads of writers that are very prescriptive and very planned, and you know, are very incredibly successful and probably more efficient with their time than I am. But yeah, that's my process, and so far it seems to work for me. Yeah, I like just seeing where things go.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important things that we talk about a lot, again, in the community, about how everyone needs to find the process that works for them. Some people love the writing and hate the editing. Some people hate the writing and love the editing. Some people know everything that's going to happen. I think particularly in sci-fi, people maybe are more likely to have planned more out and figured out what this world is that they're going to set their scene in, just because of the complexity of it all. Can you, I don't want to give any spoilers away for The Pharmacist, but can you give just like a short summary of what it is, so that as we talk about these things, people will know what we're talking about?
Yeah, so The Pharmacist it follows a character called Wolf, who is the pharmacist of a nuclear bunker, and she spends her days kind of monotonously doling out medication to the inhabitants while they wait for the outside world to heal. But as the kind of paranoid and erratic leader of the bunker, political leader of the bunker, takes a shine to Wolf, he says, you know, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. And she begins to kind of give up things for her own kind of improved life within the bunker. And I think essentially the question is, like, how far are you willing to go? How much are you willing to sacrifice of your own kind of moral conscience for your own survival? So yeah, I'd say that's hopefully that's a concise little neat description.
That's a good precise world. And I feel like the two things you do really well in it are create this world that is both familiar. Like in reading it, I understood what was where. Like, it didn't have the complexity of some sci-fi novels where you have to understand, you know, complex governing systems of foreign cosmos. But it also was very different and had this like ominous, claustrophobic sort of feel all the way through. And I think the way you put those two things together was really interesting. But I also think your characters, which were quite problematic at times, is really interesting as well. So we'll delve into both of those. Shall we do the world first?
Okay. So yeah, I came at it feeling like I wanted it to feel familiar. So I wanted it to be a world that doesn't exist but could exist. You know, it's a world recognizable to us, and I saw it as something of like a kind of microcosm of our own society. I think there's something really interesting about putting people, because I think we're all capable of putting them into this kind of contained, intense space and seeing what we're all capable of doing. So that was kind of the thought behind creating the world. But yeah, with anything that's kind of speculative sci-fi, the world's really difficult because you're going to get interrogated by it. You know, people are going to try and actively find holes. So you have to make sure it's as watertight as possible. And I think you're right about, you know, some people, when they create really intense new worlds, have to plan it to a kind of, you know, to the inch. Whereas I suppose my logic was bringing a lot of my own experience from my community pharmacy. So I mean, there's a lot of scenes in the book where she's in her pharmacy space. A lot of that was brought from the real world, and I just kind of constantly tried to kind of anchor myself to the bunker that I'd visited. So everything that I wanted to do, I'd say, well, how would they have done that in that bunker? And I would spend my days just, you know, I would drink a cup of coffee and think, could you have coffee in the bunker? How would you facilitate that? Who would be? So I think, I mean, I was probably an absolute nightmare to live with my husband, because just everything became about how you live from our world versus the bunker. So I say I don't plan, but I probably lived in that space for a long, long time before I put pen to paper.
Well, then it's happening in your head. It's all the pieces are coming together,
and
even if it's not down on paper.
Absolutely. And I think that's actually a really worthwhile thing mentioning, is that even when you're not writing physically, you are kind of still writing up here. You're always kind of thinking and creating. And I tend to find that, you know, writers never switch off. I could be cooking the dinner and I'll turn the tap on, and, you know, my children could catch me just kind of looking out through the window, and it's as if, you know, my mind's gone. It's gone to this place or this world that I'm thinking about. So yeah, I think writers are never off, as I think you kind of are always writing, for better or for worse. And I think I was just very conscious of that when I was trying to bring this world together. And don't get me wrong, you know, we went through several edits, and every time I would always think of something like, oh, can I add that in? Can I add that in? And it was just about making sure that the editors were coming back, the proofreaders were coming back, and everybody felt like the world was as watertight as it could possibly be. But it's fun. I mean, I think that's probably one of the attractions to writing speculative fiction, is creating these worlds are really interesting and fun. And it's a puzzle, you know, you're always kind of putting pieces together and saying, does that work? Can that be pulled apart? Or will someone believe that? But I think I probably got away with it easier because I wasn't creating this unrecognizable world. I was trying to create a space that was easy for you to imagine. Well, that could be me, that could be you. Bunkers exist, so why not, really?
Yeah, well, then I love those little moments of familiarity. Like, within this world, nobody's cooking or anything. Everyone's allocated food pouches, similar to what, I don't know if it's the same in the States, but in the UK, when I was feeding my kids, and the little pouches say like spaghetti bolognese on them, or shepherd's pie or whatever, but it's just brown mush inside. Like, it's a far distance, and I felt like I could taste it. I remembered that from when my kids were little, and it was and I thought, of course, that's a great way to feed people that are in a bunker with this stuff that has the nutrients. Very effective, not a bit joyless, but effective.
But yeah, and I kind of also thought of it as space food as well. I think, you know, we do have these systems where we send people off to places that they can't leave for a prolonged period of times, and they obviously have to have nutrition. So yeah, I think when you start to think of it like that, you think, oh, actually, it's not too far removed, you know, from other things that we already do in the world.
Yeah, and there's the way you handle trauma within this world is really interesting, because the main character herself, Wolf, doesn't experience any major assaults or anything like that, but there's this undercurrent that all of that is happening within the bunker, and she's having to treat them. And so the awareness that all of this is happening is slightly terrifying all the way through it. Was that on purpose?
Yes. Yeah, that's the short answer. Just because I think that, particularly for women, it's a dangerous world out there, and I'd like to think that things are getting better, and there's obviously been a bit more traction with the whole like Me Too movement. But yeah, and I think what I also wanted was for it to feel like it was very commonplace, and almost for her to be kind of desensitized by that, because I think there is something to that. I think terrible things are happening all around us, not just kind of sexual abuse, but generally in the world. And I think it's very difficult to kind of continue to be focused without becoming somewhat desensitized to the issues around you. So yeah, that was very kind of intentional, just because I thought that also for you to survive and kind of engage day to day within the bunker space, you're going to have to be a bit like that. You're going to have to desensitize, but still be kind of prickly, you know, feel like it's all around you and anything could happen at any moment. So
yeah, interesting. So we can come back to the world, and for if anyone has any specific questions that they want me to ask Rachelle, just pop them in the Q&A box that should be on your screen, and I can always add those. And there's a few people that are saying that they recognize the feeling of having your subconscious working in the background while you're doing other things, and while you're, I'm sure,
and that's where the magic
if you
happens.
have felt that, yeah, I'm sure everybody recognizes that feeling. So let's talk about your main character, your protagonist, who is really interesting, really flawed, really sometimes quite unlikable character, but somehow you're still on side with her, even as she starts to do things that are pretty questionable. I still felt like I was on her side. So can you talk a little bit about how she was born and how you put those characteristics together?
So of Wolf, I knew quite early on that I wanted it to be one voice that carried the story, and I wanted her to be flawed, and also it be very much seen as an unreliable narrator. I think one, because I felt like that would add to the claustrophobia of the environment, and two, because I think I'm very interested generally in unreliable narrators, and I like this idea that you're getting her narration. You know, it's not necessarily the right narration or the correct narration, but you're getting her take on it, and that's all you're seeing. And I think we're all kind of capable of being our own unreliable narrators. And we're all very flawed. So I think to me, it felt like the most human way to kind of to get this story across and live within this space. And I think kind of adds to the claustrophobia, or hopefully adds to the claustrophobia. And I think her voice, I mean, I found her voice quite quickly and it felt really strong for me. And I just kind of let her lead. I mean, I really did just let her kind of go. And to me, she's kind of a real person. But I was quite conscious, because obviously there's lots of different kind of speculative and dystopian fiction out there. I didn't really want her to come across like a victim or someone that needed rescuing. So and she realizes as the novel develops that she actually has her own power. The fact that she's the pharmacist, the fact that she's in charge of medicine and that she sees so many people, it brings a power that actually a lot of the other inhabitants in the bunker don't have. And so when I didn't really realize that at the start, it wasn't until I started writing, I was like, oh, she has more power than other people. And I just thought that was a really interesting way to explore power, and how we kind of treat each other. And so that's how she evolved. But I also just wanted to be as realistic as possible about the space. And I kind of have this belief that actually when you push someone to their absolute limit, they're capable of anything. I think we're all capable of things we can't even imagine. And so I wanted to kind of explore that through Wolf. So yes, very much there are things that she does. She's not always a good person. She's not always a likable person, but I think she's very human. And I think perhaps that's why people can continue to relate to her. I think it's interesting because I think if the story wasn't told from her perspective, I think you would probably have very different feelings about her. That's what I imagine.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, if it was told by some of the other people. I mean, in some ways, a pharmacist is an ideal profession for a character because she has to interact with all these different people and constantly. It gives her access to people, and it gives her. You can see her inner world, I think, in a way that. And I liked how you could see how she was making justifications to herself about the things that she was doing, you know, and you could understand that process that she was going through. It was really interesting.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I found her a really interesting character to write. Would I want to be her best friend? Probably not. But But I think she's also got a lot of things going on underneath. She's mixed race, and I mean, I'm mixed race, and I've always kind of been interested in like identity and how people see you, how you see yourself, and how others see you. And what I thought was interesting for Wolf is that she's someone that probably shouldn't be in the bunker. She's kind of slipped through the net for one reason or another, and I think that kind of adds to her behaviour around the others. So I think complex characters are really interesting. I want to read about complex characters and I like to write about complex characters. And I think the more kind of conflict you can give a character, the more interesting your story. I'm sure there's not that saying, if the film or the story is boring, it's because not enough bad things are kind of happening to your character. I'm kind of a believer of that. So yeah, I wanted to see like how much can she deal with and how much can she impose upon other people as well. And the pharmacy aspect is interesting because up until I started writing this novel, and I was also working on a short film at the same time, I'd never ever written about pharmacy. Like I compartmentalized it. I think pharmacy was the day job and writing kind of contemporary short stories was my hobby. So I think maybe it was like a survival instinct on my part to kind of separate the two worlds. I also thought maybe there is not that much literature about pharmacists. So I kind of also naively thought maybe no one's interested in what a pharmacist has to say.
Exciting world of
yeah, who knows?
Wild world of pharmacists. Yeah.
And then when I kind of landed on the fact that it should be a pharmacist, there was so much of the pharmacy just kind of poured out. And I just thought, actually, I think people do want to know about these. I think these little kind of quite intimate moments that she has in the pharmacy are of interest. I think when I was actually doing the job, you would see these people that you don't know are coming in and you can see them at their most vulnerable. And I think that's such an interesting interaction to have with somebody that you might not even know their name, but you understand so much about their private life just through their medicine or the things they want to tell you in a consultation room. So I find that quite interesting. And obviously with the difference of the pharmacy, yeah. And I think the difference as well with a doctor is you have to have an appointment to go and see a doctor, whereas with a pharmacist, anyone can just walk in the door. So there was a lot of that, the dynamics of that job that just seemed to fit into the novel in a very kind of organic and natural way. And now so many people, everyone's like, are you going to write something else about a pharmacist? And a lot of my film work is about pharmacy. And I'm like, I don't write just about pharmacy. So yeah, it's interesting, but it seems to be that there is an appetite for people to actually hear some of these stories.
Yeah, number one, Amazon for fiction about pharmacy fiction.
That's my niche, yeah.
Number one, best-selling author. But you never know. I mean, there's so many niches out there, and there's so many people that are interested. And think how many pharmacists there are in the world that would probably be quite thrilled that that their job is being seen in this way as being really intimate and really and holding a bit of power. And if you mess up as a pharmacist, it has pretty major consequences. I mean, it's actually, when you think about it, there's a lot of really incredible elements to being a pharmacist.
Yeah.
So let's talk about ND, who is the leader of this. It's ND, right?
Yeah, that's right.
He's the leader of this underground bunker. How would you describe him?
Oh, indeed. He is complex and charismatic. He is perhaps based on several populist leaders that have been put into positions of power in the world that we exist in. And he's someone that will probably do anything to retain the power that he holds. He's very self-serving. He doesn't really care about others, so he definitely has some kind of narcissistic sociopath kind of tendencies, but he's a bit of a panpiper, so he leads people will follow, they will listen to him. So he was the kind of political leader of the country before we assume the nuclear war happened. And he's brought these people into the bunker with him, and he still retains power and control, but it's not obvious, particularly to Wolf, until she starts to learn who he is, that he's actually living a much more bearable life than the rest of them in the bunker. And he's very manipulative. Yeah, he'll do anything to kind of retain the power that he has.
And when you were building those two characters, Wolf and ND, it felt like in some ways they were opposites of each other, the way I don't think it's a spoiler to say that he has a problem with pharmaceuticals, more recreational pharmaceuticals, or maybe not recreational, that's maybe not the right word, but he
Yeah,
has
he's
some addiction issues. And so it's a really nice way that they fit together. And how much did you plan that, and how much did that just happen?
I wish I could say it was all planned. Most of that happened as I started to learn the characters. So I suppose for me, like my first draft is me just trying to understand everybody. I think everyone's first draft is terrible, apart from like Muriel Spark or somebody like that. But I knew that they were, in one way I think they're very different, and then in other ways I think they actually have a lot of similar traits, depending on the situation. And I think maybe that's why he's kind of drawn to her. But he's gone over an edge that I think Wolf was always very reluctant to go over. There's kind of a line drawn, and he has no issues with kind of crossing the line, whereas she kind of constantly dabbles backwards and forwards. But yeah, as I needed them to kind of engage with each other. And then it kind of, again, one of those light bulb moments when you're like, oh, of course he should have like an addiction like that. She's going to bring medicine to him. And then as soon as you have that moment, then everything kind of clicks into place. Or even like I would go back to the beginning of the draft, I would write a line and I'm like, well, that line makes perfect sense, even though I didn't know at the time that he was going to have a drug addiction. So yeah, I think there's a lot of luck sometimes, and then when you do go backwards and forwards, yeah, you see things slotting into place. And then once I realized his drug addiction, I also then realized, he's something of almost like a cult leader, as a lot of these kind of political leaders are. And actually, when you kind of go back and look through the history bits, a lot of them do have drug addictions. So again, it was making me think, well, actually, that's quite grounded. That seems like very, very plausible. I'm very conscious with my writing that I want everything to be as plausible as possible. I get quite irritated when I'm reading something and I just think, no, that would never happen. So yeah, I'm always kind of treading this line of is that realistic? Is that plausible? And obviously that kind of their relationship is the arc of the whole book, really. Regardless of the setting, it's them engagement with each other that is the real narrative of the story.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I've got an interesting question here from someone that says, what's your opinion on characters who may not have a traumatic backstory or evolution? Because this person grew up never really experiencing hard trauma like some of the others around them. Is it possible to write a simple character without that trauma that can still be worth caring for?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I think as long as you can find their voice, then yeah, you need to go with them and explore them. I think when I look back, I mean, Wolf is probably one that has one of the least traumatic backgrounds, and has particularly going into the bunker. She has what's interesting for me. Although Wolf perhaps doesn't have as much trauma as other people, to her, to her, she still feels very sorry for herself. And I think we're all capable of that, regardless of anyone that's lived. If you get someone that has a perfect life, or you think that they have a perfect life, there's still going to be things in their minds that they are either embarrassed about or worried about, ashamed about, feel sorry about. And I think it's just trying to pull all that feels human about that character and bringing it to the surface. Yes, obviously you need to have conflict to drive a story. Your character needs to want something, and find it difficult to get that, but yeah, they don't have to have had the most horrific background to be interesting. I think you just need to understand them.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and even some of those perfect, if you were to have a perfect life, then you are incapable of dealing with problems, and that survivalist instinct maybe isn't as honed in you. Exactly. So but then when you're put into some like a more problematic environment, maybe you're much less capable, and that's how it feeds into your character.
And I think that there are characters in the bunker who have, like, before they came to the bunker, they're only there because they had a very privileged life, and actually their privilege means nothing now inside, and they're almost reassessing, well, what is their identity now? And I think, even with real life, I'm guilty of looking at, film stars or famous people and being like, wow, imagine having all that, and it must be ideal. And actually I think a lot of them are miserable. So I think it's about kind of pulling the insecurities of each of your characters to the surface.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, because we are pro writing aid, I always am slightly more interested than is normal in people's editing process. Do you like the editing process? Are you a happy editor?
I am a happy editor. I think I don't particularly like writing first drafts just because I know how terrible they are. And I think for me, the real craft kind of comes into play when you're editing, because to me, editing is you're just making something better. You're continuously working at getting something to be better than it was in its last kind of draft or form. I am trying to think. I love editing other people's work as well, because I think I can see other people's work clearer than my own work.
Yeah.
But yeah, editing takes me a long time, but I would say that's kind of like my happier place in the process of bringing a novel to life.
Talk us through the timeline of when you were in Berlin and you saw The Bunker and The Seed appeared to when it was published in May this year?
Yeah, well, that was, and again, I think every book has a different journey, but this one, so I had got the idea visiting the bunker, probably left it about 4 or 5 months before I started actively writing the novel. I wrote the first draft very quickly, quickly for me, so that was probably about 6 months to the first draft. And then I worked, I might as well have been in a bunker myself. I edited and edited and edited for probably about another 5 or 6 months. So it was less than a year, I would say, until I had a draft that I was ready to show to some agents. And so I'd had some interest with agents from the Scottish Book Trust Award that I'd written, but it was all for kind of short stories. And shock horror, it's very difficult to sell a collection of short stories unless you're relatively well known. So they'd all kind of come back to me and said, we like your writing, but come to us when you maybe have you have a novel. And so I did, and I approached, there was 3 agents that I'd kind of spoken to, and there was one that was my favorite. So I approached her when I felt like I had a draft that I was ready to show people, and she read it within about 5 days, and I signed with her. So that was a very lovely, very quick process getting my agent. Wow. I think having had the kind of because you're avoiding the slush pile. So obviously, because I'd won the Scottish Book Trust Award and I'd been engaging with agents already, that process was probably easier. I had tried to write a novel before that, and not speculative, and had approached from the slush pile, and it was just crushing. Whereas I'm sure many people can relate to the process of going through the slush pile. So the agent was that. The second time, obviously, with the pharmacist, that was a much more joyous experience. But it probably took us another 2 years to sell it because I hadn't figured out how I wanted to end the novel. So, and again, just a learning curve. I wanted to write a novel that was set in one space that you did not leave. And actually that's very, very difficult to end, and particularly end on a kind of hopeful note. So it took me a while to figure out how to end it. And I think at that point also maybe Wolf and Endy's relationship wasn't as defined as it is in the final draft. So I think it just took me a while to realize that actually that was the arc I had to focus on. So it took me 2 years of probably a bit of time out. I was working on some screenwriting, and actually through that, I came back to it thinking, I know what I need to do now. So I did another redraft, maybe spent 3 months redrafting, took some more notes from my agent, and then that brought us to 2020 of February. So yeah, over 3 years, I would say it took by that point. And then we were ready to go out in submission, and it sold within a week. So yeah, it went from then, I don't know how to end it in 2 years later, to it selling quite quickly. And I got a 2-book deal. So the second novel that's now written, coming out next year. And that's been a very different process because I had to write it on to deadline, to demand. And like, I hate it. I cannot tell you how much I hated writing it. I mean, I love it now. I'm very happy with the way it's turned out. But I think there's this huge shift from writing something just for the hope, for the love of writing, like The Pharmacist, because you don't know if something's going to get published. You're really taking a leap of faith, aren't you? You like to put pen to paper and commit real time to a project as big as a novel. And you've got all the time in the world. You know, no one's pressuring you to kind of get the first novel published. It's all you that puts the pressure on. And then with the second novel, all of a sudden they're saying, can you write something similar but different, and can you do it in a year? You're like, yeah, I'll give it a go. So yeah, that's
so talk a bit more about that. So what was different about the second process? How did you pants it in the same sort of way? Did you already have a seed?
I knew what I wanted to write about. I knew the topic, but I So the second novel is about water shortages. So it's kind of climate orientated, and it's set on a livestock farm near the Scotland-England border. And it's basically about how society behaves when water becomes this kind of scarce and sacred commodity, which is nothing new in other parts of the world, but I think in kind of Western culture, it's not something to think about. The way we use water isn't often thought about, maybe until now. So this is something I had been trying to write for a few years, but it's such a huge topic that I really struggled to grapple with it, and I wasn't sure how I was going to do it, and I tried various different ways. And so when I came to it as the second, and they asked me in the meeting when they were about to sign the first contract, what is it you want to write next? They knew that this was the topic that I was going to address. But I think there's that pressure. I think one, imposter syndrome. I don't think I've spoken to so many writers who are far more experienced than me, and they say that just never leaves. Like each novel, you learn something and you probably get more mature in your writing, but you still have that sense of, I'm going to get caught out at some point and someone's going to tell me to leave the room. And so there was that. There was also just this immense pressure of, what if the best of me has gone into this first novel? What if there's nothing left to create something of interest? And so I think I was just grappling with a lot of that. At the same time, the first novel was going into proof form, and the anxiety of letting that out into the world, and obviously it's not really yours anymore, I think was kind of coincided with me having to then go back to the desk and write the second novel. And again, I wanted it to be an unreliable narrator. I wanted it to be first person. And I think also having to make sure that that's different. It's very easy to almost write your character again, but you're like, well, this is a different story and it's a different person. So how do you make sure that voice is different? And it's just through sheer graft and edits and backwards and forwards. And then, yeah, we got there in the end, and I'm happy. And I think it was a real interesting process. I think I've learned a lot from it as a writer. I've also learned that it's not easy to write all the time. I think before being published, because it was my hobby, it was my joy, and I think it's still my joy, but there's a shift in dynamic when you're now being paid to deliver something. I hope that doesn't put people off writing. But again, I think being a writer is just a continual learning curve, and you're just always learning, and you think you reach one kind of goalpost and you've made it, and actually there's just another one behind it, and you have to learn something different for that. So that would be the journey of of writing my second novel. But yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, interesting. I've got a really good a question here from Casey. He or she, Casey could be either. Casey wonders whether wants to know a bit more about writing the end of your story, because they say it's the details that are hard. How do you make it so it doesn't feel lame or cliche?
Oh, well, that's the fear, isn't it? The cliche is my biggest fear.
And I don't think yours does feel cliche in the end.
Okay, well, thank you. My ending, I don't think I'm giving much away to say. It's somewhat open-ended. So there is an absolute resolution about what happens between Wolf and the leader, which is the main arc of the story. But the world of the bunker is still somewhat unresolved, in the sense that you don't really know. There's the tone of what potentially will happen in the future. But which I think some people really like and some people don't, and that's just fair enough, because I think some people, there'll be people out there that like everything to be wrapped up and explained, end of, and that's just never really been my writing. I think coming as a short story writer, you've always left room for the reader. That was how I was taught to write. That's what I like to read. So I have carried those principles from short story through into novel writing, and I have left a lot of room at lots of parts of the book for kind of interpretation from the reader, for space for the reader to also have their thoughts. And I do that at the end. And mostly because I also feel like when you give absolute resolution to something, it's never as satisfying as actually the reader's imagination. And I think the minute you give someone a definitive answer, they go, oh, okay. And what I wanted with The Pharmacist was also for you to be thinking about it afterwards. I wanted you to kind of have these long, lingering ideas and thoughts about her intentions, the world that she's still in, what it means kind of for society generally. So I think to have left it with those questions for me is an interesting thing. I think you also had to go with your gut instinct. Don't feel pressured into writing something just because you think that the reader or the audience that you're giving it to want that. I think you as a writer have an obligation to put down what you think and you feel, and never feel like you're writing for an audience. Because I think that just becomes very prescriptive then, and you can very easily lose the heart and soul of what it was you were actually trying to write. The ending, as I said, I found it really difficult, but once I kind of grasped what the core story was, it was much easier to find, like, okay, there's resolution with that, but I still want my readers to be thinking about these characters and what they're doing now. And so I think it's maybe just trying to, think about what's important to you within the story. What do you want to keep or give away to the reader, and kind of bring that to your ending. And just be firm in the edits, red pen, cut all the darlings, and you can always put them back in, but just be quite brutal, I would say, and honest with yourself when you're doing the edit of what feels right.
Yeah, well, so it's interesting. There's a question from Doc Raymond saying, when you're editing, do you do more adding of words or more removing of words?
It tends to be both. It tends to be the first edit becomes less. So from first draft to second draft usually gets shorter. And then from then on, it gets longer. And I don't know if that's regular for other writers. I'm quite guilty of not putting enough in. I'm not a huge fan of backstory, so I'm always just trying to give the reader the absolute bare minimum that they need. Sometimes my editors will say, can we just have a touch more? So I tend to find that I add more. So, with the second novel that's coming out, I think The Pharmacist ended up being about 94,000 words, which is longer than anything I'd ever written before. And then with the second novel, I thought maybe 90, and it's ended up at about 102,000. So yeah, it's certainly, as the editing develops, I would say as you go into kind of third and fourth draft, for me, it tends to get bigger. Only because there's always, again, this is where I think planning comes into it. There will always be things about my world that I think, well, actually, I better add that in. Even today, I mean, my second book's about to go to, it's been copy edited, so it's been signed off, so it's about to go to typesetting proof. And even today, I was thinking, I really want to add something about an empty water swimming pool. I can visualize the whole scene. And I mean, my editors will be nice. They'll let me kind of sneak that in. But I think I feel like I'm never done until it's like forced from me. I'm always thinking and tweaking. Because I do think when you leave things open to interpretation, it's quite interesting. The way even you might word a sentence can mean so much to different people. So yeah, I'm always tweaking right until the end, until they're physically like, no more, stop now. But I don't know whether maybe with as I mature as a writer, perhaps I'll be better at just going, right, that's enough. I'm done. We'll see.
Oh, I don't know. I think I've interviewed quite a few writers at all of these events, and I feel like nobody ever has that sense of like, now this is
yeah, never. Yeah.
There's always more you can do. And I mean, it must be really different to have other people, like, do you change a lot based on what your editors say and what feedback you get around, I need a bit more, like, what are some things you added to The Pharmacist, for example, that people suggested you did a bit more filling out?
What did I add? I added a bit more context to, probably added more details about ND than I originally had, although it's difficult to tell now because I feel it all the experience kind of merges into one. I probably gave a bit more foreshadowing towards Wolf. Sometimes I had a habit of kind of ending a chapter maybe a little bit abruptly, and they would say, could we just have a little bit more of her thoughts, her kind of internal thought before you end? And I think they're all really valid points. I mean, my editors are great, and we have a really good relationship. They're very good at giving me notes, and then I take a bit of time to read. And usually their notes are absolutely spot on, but they're very also good at not telling me how to correct something. So it's more of a like, I think you need something else here, have a think. And I think that for me, that works quite well. I like to be told what's not working, but I usually like to come at it with the solution list myself. And sometimes they'll say that's just not working at all. Fair enough. But it's been a really collaborative process we have. And I can't speak for other editors and other authors, but for our relationship, we seem to have a nice balance of them giving me notes, listening to them, I take them on, and then I'll come back. I think I'm answering them all, but I'm maybe answering them in a way that they perhaps weren't expecting. So it's a kind of backwards and forwards of us both going, oh yeah, that now works. What about this? So we usually, again, I don't know if this is, we'll see what book 3 is like, but we usually have kind of 3 rounds of edits for me, and then it goes to copy edit. But then I spoke to my friend and she's like, oh no, we do about 8 rounds. So I think it very much, depends on your editor and how you work. But yeah, I'm kind of obsessive. I probably live with the story at every stage until it's finally ready to be handed over.
Yeah, well, it feels like that. I can feel that in your writing. A couple of people are asking about your screenplay work. So how is writing a screenplay different from writing this novel?
Very, I would say, mostly because with a screenplay, as I said before, you have to do an awful lot of outlining. A screenplay to me almost feels more like a fly on the wall experience. So you are trying to capture the emotions of the room, of what people are doing, without really, I mean, I suppose with some films you can have like an internal monologue over the top, but that doesn't tend to be my style. But you're trying to basically convey all the things that Wolf is thinking and saying, or thinking anyway. You're trying to almost capture that in the mood or the tone of the setting and the way they engage with each other. And it's again, it's like a puzzle that just kind of interests me. It's like, how do you tell this story in a visual way? And I think the best way I can describe a screenplay is almost like get a blueprint. You know, you're handing a blueprint over to somebody else, the director. And so I think obviously there's a lot of people in the industry who are writer directors, and some are, I mean, obviously there are amazing writer directors out there, but we tend to find that actually a lot of directors are writing their own work because they don't want to give up any form of control of their vision. I'm not a director. I think I wouldn't know how to bring that story visually to life. So the way I need to work is to make sure that I'm working with a director that really understands the point of my story and what I imagined my story to be like. And if we work well together, then they bring to life something that I agree with, is maybe the wrong word, but you know, there's horror stories of you hand over something and the intention of your story is completely lost because the director takes it in a different way. But on the flip side, I love the collaboration. I think with when you're writing books, oh yes, you have your editor, but everything is kind of on you. It's your world that you've created. Whereas actually collaboratively work on producers and directors, sometimes they bring something to life that needed them, you know, that you think, oh, actually that's better. It's better because I got to work with you for this visual story. So they're very different, but I think there's things from both disciplines that actually make me a better storyteller. I think having done a lot of script work with my short film and in my feature film, through each process, I think, oh, actually, I'm going to think more about that when I work on the next novel. So I think I'm just very interested in storytelling, and
Yeah.
I think there's some stories that are better told, in novel or screen, and I think it's just kind of trying to figure out what's the way you want to tell the story.
Yeah, I've never really thought about it that way, but I feel like your novel it takes place in Wolf's head so intensely, like everything is in her head, that to be able to tell a story for you that has nothing in her head and is just told through dialogue and, you know, visual cues and action must be a very different experience. So I can see how you would learn from one and the other as you go back and forth.
Absolutely.
Do you have this film that you're working on? Is it coming out? Where are you at in that process?
We are, so it's now written, and the BBC film had been paying for the development up until this point. So we're now at the stage of trying to attach the right director and producer and get the finance in place. So fingers crossed. But it's kind of up in that space at the moment where you're like, if everything aligns, then yeah, we'll get the green light. But you know, there's many moving parts, and if a few of them fall out, then yeah, the project stalls. So that's the difference as well about writing books versus screen. With books, you tend to find that you don't really earn money until you've sold the book. But if you sell the book, you know that it's going to become a book. So like, I sign my contract, I get paid in advance, but I know on this date, I will be able to hold a book that is mine. Whereas with screenwriting, you tend to get paid, if you're established enough, I suppose, and you are working with organizations, you will get paid from the minute you start developing. But that doesn't mean that the project will actually end up on the screen. So there's a lot of screenwriting that you get paid for to develop, but it will never come to anything. it's just there.
Strange to think that there's all these ideas and stories, sitting in the files in the BBC offices, just that may or may not anyone will ever hear. Oh, there's something slightly heartbreaking about
I
that.
know,
At least
yeah.
now that you've written a book and you're a published author, for you to write more books. Presumably they will see the light of day and find their readers.
Hopefully, yeah. Fingers crossed.
Jonathan wants to know if there's any Egyptian influence in your writing.
Yes, there is. So, I mean, there's quite a lot of there's a few references to Egypt or her memories of Egypt in the novel. Some of my short stories have often had Egypt as their setting. My dad would just randomly tell me stories of family members or little snippets of things, and I would think, oh, that is a brilliant seed for a story. So yeah, my dad probably should be getting some royalties for some of my work. But yeah, I think there is, it wasn't intentional. There's something about Egypt in The Pharmacist. There's also something about Egypt in my next novel. I think it's just because it's part of me, it just feels like quite a natural thing to write about. Obviously none of the characters are me and I'm not them, but I think without you realizing it, you kind of give a little bit of yourself up in everything that you write. Yeah,
great. Okay, we are basically out of time. God, that went fast, didn't it? I feel like I could sit here chatting with you all afternoon about all the other elements. Let us know in the chat if you found that helpful, and go and buy The Pharmacist, which is out already at all your, I assume it's released in the US as well?
It hasn't had an official, I don't really know what's happening with the US publishers. I know people can buy it from Amazon at the moment. Someone in Canada was saying that they couldn't, and now they can buy it. So I'm not really sure what's happening with Hodder and the publishers over there. But yeah, maybe at some point I'll be told. Yeah, but you can get it on Amazon.
Track it down. I believe in you. Go and find it. It's such a fascinating read, and it's really murky and claustrophobic. And I don't know if you've thought this, but there was something slightly Squid Game about where they lived, all of the bunk beds and all of that sort of. It's interesting how readers fill in those blanks.
And
that are sort of familiar.
I mean, I love Squid Game, so yeah, I'll take that. I'll take that comment.
That same sort of feeling of just somebody's watching and anything could be happening and nobody really knows what's going on.
Just when the book got bought, we then went into a pandemic, and I thought, oh, no one's going to want to read a book about a pharmacist stuck in a nuclear bunker. And I think my publishers were a bit kind of like, oh, do we use the word dystopian? And then Squid Game came on, and I was like, well, if people like Squid Game, then surely there's an appetite, for some kind of messy dystopian fiction. So yeah,
exactly. Maybe there's something. Maybe people want to imagine something worse than where they are and what they're doing. So for everyone else, don't forget that you can watch all of the replays. And if you can't find Rachelle's book, drop us a line and we'll see if we can track it down for you and help you find that. And if you're not already in our community over on Circle, jump on there. And I think that's it for today. Thanks everybody for coming, and thank you so much, Rachelle. We've really enjoyed this.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much.
All right, take care everybody. See you next time.
Bye.